After a few decades of doing this, I've had more injuries than I can count. I've broken more than 50 of my 206 bones, and that's to say nothing of the strains, sprains, cuts, bruises, and everything else. Which begs this question: who is to blame for all of this? I'm Mike Quackenbush. This is Till We Make It. And I've been fortunate throughout my career to work in front of the camera as a professional wrestler, commentator, ring announcer, and referee. And I've worked behind the scenes in the pro wrestling industry as well as a promoter, booker, agent, coach, and consultant. If you're passionate about professional wrestling and you're never done learning all about the craft, well, you're in a good place. Consider subscribing to my channel right now and enable notifications so you find out every time that I publish. Today's Till We Make It is inspired by a trainee that I had for a period of about 2 years. And anytime they were injured, whether it be getting a fat lip or jamming a toe during practice, they made sure to loudly and publicly blame someone else for what happened. It was never anything they did that caused that bloody nose or that pulled calf muscle. It was always someone else who was being negligent or deficient in some way, and it was often implied that this had been done to them with malicious intent. Up front, I think it's important to acknowledge there are people out there who correlate apologizing with weakness, and so they cannot accept any blame for fear that it might put them in a position where they would be forced to apologize. There are other people out there who see this practice modeled by their parents or their role models, and so they adopt it as their own. And of course, there are also people out there who just have to assign away any blame before it can be assigned to them because at some past point, they may have faced an embarrassment or humiliation when they owned up to their mistakes or to results that were considered unsatisfactory. This pattern of assigning away all blame to someone else for any misstep or mistake that's made in the ring is certainly not unique to my former trainee. However, thinking back about this today, a few things started to spring to mind, and I want to share them with you now. But please, keep in mind, this is just my opinion. It's my perspective. So, the first thing that sprung to my mind is this. Pro wrestling is inherently risky. It is risky to you when you are untrained. It is risky while you're going through your training. It is risky during your apprentice phase. It is risky throughout your entire career. Professional wrestling is an inherently risky pursuit. And it doesn't matter how well trained, how well rehearsed, or how well traveled you are never immune to that risk of physical injury. Anyone that claims that pro wrestling is perfectly safe and that you run no risk of injury while training or performing is just wrong. They are flat out wrong. There's no version of live combat theater entirely devoid of the risk of physical injury. In addition to that, accidents do happen all the time. And if you cannot accept that pro wrestling is inherently risky and that accidents happen all the time, I think you should choose today to get out. So that was the first thing I thought of. And the second thing was this. I took some time to go back through my mental files. And for quick reference, I've been in thousands of pro wrestling matches. I could recall only 2 instances where my opponent set out to intentionally injure me during the course of the match and could justifiably be held at fault for the results. Just 2 times. Even if we triple that number, it's still less than 1% of the time by quite a margin. That's just considering my matches. For every match I've wrestled, there's roughly 5 hours of corresponding training time I've also spent in the ring with other people. And even if you tally all of that up, we're well below 1% of the time. Now, do I recall every single workout, training session, and performance I've ever had in a wrestling ring? I kinda doubt it. But I think the occasions when someone set out to intentionally hurt me are the kind of things I am likely to remember. And any way you put it all together and analyze it, we're talking about well below 1% of the time. So when I consider this first thing, but then also consider this second thing, what I'm left to conclude from my own experience is this. We as professional wrestlers must get comfortable with a certain level of risk of physical injury in order to do what we do. And while it is possible someone, while we are training or performing, might set out to intentionally do us physical harm, actual instances of that are extraordinarily uncommon. In my opinion, making a habit of blaming someone else for every injury you're going to incur over the course of your wrestling career is a futile exercise. Not only will it weaken your relationships with others, it will eventually reflect poorly on you, and all of this will be to the detriment of your career. No one will make you be a professional wrestler. No one will force you to slide between the ropes. But if I do that, then I am choosing to expose myself to the risk of physical injury. And should that injury eventually occur, I happen to think the person who needs to be saddled with the blame first and foremost is yours truly, because I made the choice to be exposed to that risk. One of the most serious injuries I suffered back in the 1990s was when a metal spike tore my scalp open, and the result was a pretty serious head trauma and the loss of a lot of blood. I spent the whole night at the hospital being put back together. And I'll tell you very plainly, do I blame the wrestler I was performing with for this injury? No. Do I blame the ring crew for not making sure the spike was properly secured before the match? No. Do I find the promoter to be at fault for booking a venue where this atypical setup was required? No. Do I blame the rookie who drove so slowly to the venue after we left the airport that I didn't have enough time to troubleshoot the ring like I do before virtually every show? No. Do I blame the airline for not departing Philadelphia on time, thus giving me enough time at the destination to do the type of troubleshooting I would like to do? No. Do I blame the hotel staff for not being more persistent with the wake-up call to the pilot who showed up late, thus delaying our departure from... No. No, I don't. Because wrestling is risky, I accept those risks, and accidents do happen. And one of the worst injuries I suffered in recent years was having my right arm dislocated and the end of my elbow broken off. Do I blame the other wrestlers in that match with me for the injury that I suffered? No. Why? Because wrestling is risky, I accept those risks, and accidents do happen. I don't go down this blame rabbit hole, and I want to discourage you from ever doing it too. The reality is, if I decided to just blame everybody for every misstep or mistake made in the ring, the people in my sphere eventually will feel so attacked and grow so tired of that defense mechanism, no one's going to want to work with me. And if I want to publicly always assign fault to others, eventually, while I'm in the ring, someone will hesitate when we are performing. And that even split-second hesitation will open up the possibility for an entire new array of injuries to occur. I have long been of the opinion that the person to be assigned blame foremost of all is me, because I chose to accept the risk of physical injury by becoming a professional wrestler. To be clear, that doesn't mean that we can't learn something from going back over the mistakes that have happened in the ring, examining how an injury occurred, and then making changes and adjustments to ensure that these things don't happen in the future. Also, it's worth mentioning that it is not entirely impossible that someone might set out with malicious intent to attempt to do you bodily harm in the ring, but I think those instances are extraordinarily uncommon. If I heard someone saying, yeah, I've got a fat lip and you know what, Chuck did it to me, or my wrist is sprained and it's all Chris's fault, that makes me feel a certain kind of way about the person putting forth that complaint. And I guess the way it makes me feel is this: they are trying to deny the shared responsibility we all have by choosing to accept the risk of being a professional wrestler. And I also think the instances where it is necessary to loudly blame someone else for the kinds of injuries which are just part and parcel of this weird thing we've all opted into are pretty rare. I can accept that mistakes and missteps happen in a pro wrestling ring all the time. And I can also accept that injuries big and small are a real possibility while training for or performing live combat theater. But I find it far harder to accept someone who naturally defaults to blaming everyone else around them when something goes wrong. And I also find it extremely hard to accept someone who readily believes the trust all pro wrestlers must share in has been discarded. I am of the opinion that the overwhelming majority of the time, we are all doing the best that we can in the moment. And I also believe this, that the blame for my exposure to all the bumps, bruises, and breaks that have befallen me throughout my career, the lion's share of that blame is mine to own. Of course, that's just my opinion. Now I'd love to hear yours in the comments section down below. And if you'd like access to exclusive episodes of Till We Make It, plus things like book excerpts, podcasts, essays, and unreleased material of mine you won't find anywhere else, consider joining my community over on Patreon. A link to that is appearing over here somewhere right about now, as is another video that you could watch if you want to keep learning instantly. All you have to do is click on it. Really.